Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Today we have Jamie Turner with us. He is a philosophy student. Are you fourth year now or fifth year?
No, well, I'm doing my second master's, so it's probably
Second master's, mashallah.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a bit about yourself? Like where you're from, what you're doing?
Of course, yeah, man. Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you very much, man, for the invitation to come on to your show.
Yeah, no worries.
But yes, so a little bit about myself. Obviously, maybe some people who are going to watch this might have seen me before from a YouTube video about my story of how I came to Islam a few years ago. Maybe we can put it in the description.
Yeah, inshallah.
To refer people to that. But as you were saying earlier, I have changed a little bit. I don't know.
You look like you've grown a lot.
Inshallah, that's for the better, man. But yes, so I was brought up in England. I'm from Leeds originally. All of my family are from Leeds, going back a fair few generations. And we were, the family's not really religious as such, but culturally Christian. But to skip the details, in essence, I was a Christian, and then I felt there were a few problems theologically with Christianity which couldn't be resolved, particularly the Trinity, and also the problem of the biblical authenticity, in essence, and a number of issues which led me to question the faith and ultimately decide that Christianity is not true. So I learned about Islam a little bit from close friends at school, and the theology appealed to me. I thought it was rational and sensible and intuitive. And for many different reasons, I thought that the Quran couldn't have been authored by anyone but God, and that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, is a true prophet. So then I accepted Islam, and that was like 1 month before I was 70. So I was quite young, and then I went to university. I went to the University of Hull, did my undergraduate degree in philosophy and religion. Then I went back to Leeds, to the University of Leeds, to do a master's in Middle Eastern politics and international relations. But I felt that my destiny was to return back to issues in philosophy of religion, where I feel a lot more sort of passion and interest. So, well, I should mention that I did get married in between this. And
mashallah. How long have you been married?
Alhamdulillah, I've been married like 3.5 years.
And have you married a Reva or someone who's already a Muslim?
No, my wife's from Turkey. So that was why I was mentioning it, because due to certain complications and issues and things, I've ended up coming to Turkey. So I'm doing my master's now. Well, I'm in my second year of my master's, because in Turkey, they follow like the American system. So master's is 2 years rather than 1, like in the UK. So now I'm just writing my thesis and studying Arabic at the same time. And inshallah, next September, I'll start my PhD in philosophy, probably from a university in the UK.
Inshallah. Do you mind me asking, when you did your philosophy degree, what did you kind of focus on in your studies there?
It's a good question. Well, it was kind of fairly introductory. Obviously, we studied a few modules on the introduction to philosophy and various issues and logic, but I think probably I focused quite a bit in epistemology and some modules in moral philosophy and philosophy of religion. Obviously, that's really my main interest in philosophy, although I'm interested in all of the different fields, particularly epistemology and ethics. But yeah, so we did a fair few modules, but obviously my modules were shared between philosophy and religion. So yeah.
Same with me as well. Did you do a dissertation at all in your final year, or did you focus on more units?
No, I did do a dissertation. That was also on Ibn Taymiyyah. Basically, what I did was I looked at Ibn Taymiyyah as a figure who's quite controversial, and he's also been suggested to inspire a number of extremist groups. And I should say this paper was really like more sociological than philosophical.
Well, philosophy kind of branches out into everything anyway, so you end up dipping here, there, and everywhere. I think I could probably say the same with my dissertation in nihilism. Ends up being quite psychological, sociological, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. But technically, my dissertation was in the religious side of things rather than philosophy. But yeah, so it was about Ibn Taymiyyah in essence, and trying to distance him from extremism, and looking at how people have used his ideas and why they've used his ideas to inspire them, and how they've taken it out of context, and just looking at him as a figure in contemporary politics, really.
Yeah, might have to try and get that off you for a read, inshallah, if you don't mind.
It's not all that good. I don't mind.
I read worse ones. We used to share essays with each other, with the students that I studied with, and I read through them. I enjoy it. I don't mind if they're good or bad. It's nice to see how people develop. And so, like your most recent article, which we're going to be discussing today, which is the what was the name of it? An Islamic account of reformed epistemology.
Yes.
And that was, mashallah, it was a very good essay. You wrote it like I would have expected to find that in a journal, or if I was doing research for my dissertation.
It is in a journal.
I know, I noticed. That's what I'm saying. It's like...
Sorry.
No, I was just saying it's really, really good quality writing. And yeah, the argument in there, basically the topic of today is the, what did we say we were calling it? The limits of reason. So you gave me your essay on that, and I gave you my essay regarding Kant on the limits of reason. And so we're going to kind of go through that and this idea of reason and the place of reason in Islam and how it relates to belief and things like that. So what I'm going to get you to do, inshallah, if you don't mind, could you introduce and give us a summary of your essay? Basically, just summarize who it is that you were focusing on in the essay, and give a brief explanation of what this idea of reformed epistemology is, because the word reform is a bit of a controversial word as well. And
it is. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the fact that that term is used, because when people see the title, it can, what's this? Bid'ah, and what's this? Yeah. But so I think I'll start with the latter. I'll try to explain what's meant by reformed epistemology, and then move on to explaining what my paper is, what it's about. So reformed epistemology, in essence, as a thesis, is very simple. And it's just the idea that religious or theistic belief can be rational and justified without reference to philosophical arguments. So that's the thesis in and of itself, which is quite simple. And the reason why it's called reformed epistemology is because the primary proponents of this thesis in contemporary philosophy of religion were influenced, theologically speaking, by the reformed theological tradition within Christianity. So really that means Calvinism, and in reference to John Calvin. And the primary proponent of reformed epistemology in the contemporary philosophy of religion is Alvin Plantinga, who's a major figure, and he's, mashallah, he's kind of transformed the discipline in many ways. And I ask Allah to guide him to become Muslim. But yeah, so Plantinga was the guy who basically got this thesis going. And what Plantinga wanted to try to do is to look at different theories of epistemology. So before he moves on to the idea of reformed epistemology in his work, which is called Warranted Christian Belief, he has two works. One that's called Warrant the Current Debate, which you could think of as justification the current debate. He uses the term warrant, but it's what most people think of when they use the term justification. Yes. And then he has another work, which is Warrant and Proper Function. So he tries to set out an epistemological thesis known as proper functionalism. But we needn't go into that in too much detail. What Plantinga essentially is looking at is certain objections to theistic belief. So he separates two types of objection to theistic belief. One of them is called what he calls de facto objections, and the other is he calls de jure objections. So de facto objections are objections where the atheist would go, it's not rational to believe in God because on the basis of too much suffering and evil in the world, it's not possible that there is a God. So the atheists in this sense are trying to literally say God doesn't exist, and they're trying to give an argument for it. What Plantinga, he does tackle that in other essays, but what he focuses on in Reformed epistemology is the de jure objection to theistic belief. So this is where people say, I don't really know whether God exists or not, and that doesn't interest me necessarily, but they say that I know that it's not rational for you to believe in God, full stop. So he looks at, for instance, Karl Marx and Freud, who claim that, theistic belief is the result of people, wanting to construct this father figure in the sky to try and get them through the difficulties and the suffering that they go through in their lives. All right. So Plantinga, he wants to tackle this objection basically. So that's how he brings in Reformed epistemology, because he says, well, actually, that's not necessarily the case, and he tries to bring proper functionalism, which I'll explain just now briefly, to Reformed epistemology, to the thesis that religious belief can be rational without arguments, and then goes and attacks this objection. So do you want me to stop for a moment, or should I keep?
No. If you you said you were going to explain proper functionalism. It's a bit of a funky word for people that are probably not familiar with it.
Yes. So what Plantinga develops, this thesis called proper functionalism, is a term that refers to his particular theory of knowledge, if you like. So there are different ways of trying to explain how knowledge can be analyzed, and this is one thesis. And so I'm just thinking how I might go explaining this. There are a couple of complications, but in essence, proper functionalism can be broken down into 4 conditions. So Plantinga says, look, that in order for a belief to have warrant or to be sufficient for knowledge, it must be produced, number 1, by cognitive faculties which are functioning properly, okay? And then 2, that these faculties should be functioning in an environment that allows them to function. So here, for instance, if you take a perceptual belief, now a perceptual belief is what Plantinga calls a basic belief. And this is also very important because he's going to argue that God is a basic belief. This is like part of the thesis of Reformed epistemology. So he says, if you take a perceptual belief, so say I see this glass in front of me now, this is a belief that's not based on any other propositions that I'm reasoning to. It's just a basic belief which is immediate and not based on any other propositions.
Direct experience kind of thing.
Yeah, this direct experience. And in fact, if we were to try to justify this by referring to other propositions, we wouldn't really get anywhere close to justification. For instance, if I go like from the premise, it appears to me that there is a glass in front of me, to the conclusion, therefore there is a glass. But just because it appears that there is, it doesn't mean that they're necessary in an argumentative sense.
Yeah, there's other explanations for it being there. You could be hallucinating. You could be a brain in a vat.
Yeah,
In the
and
Matrix.
so on. Yeah, and we'll get on to probably some of these skeptical issues, probably, I guess. But
Inshallah.
Inshallah. So in this case, let's say I'm looking at something further away, okay, and I have my perceptual faculties are not functioning properly. There's something wrong with them. I haven't got good eyesight or something, and I look at that, and it's a sign, and I read it, and it says, something different to what I perceive it to be. And you who have, better, your perceptual faculties are working properly according to how they should work, then, you've brought about a defeater for my basic belief in this case.
Yeah.
So the first thing is, proper function. And then obviously he talks about, they should be in the right environment. For example, if we went to Mars now, all of a sudden, our cognitive faculties wouldn't be able to function properly, and so on. And then the key condition is that these faculties should be aimed at producing true beliefs. And more often than not, they should be able to do that. So this is very interesting because this relates to Plantinga's argument, which is called the Evolutionary Argument from Naturalism, because he says that if you believe in naturalism and you believe in evolution, there's a problem here, because your cognitive faculties have evolved and arisen out of a process of natural selection, random mutation, which is guided at survival and reproduction. So the development of the faculties and the beliefs that they produce are not interested in truth per se. And so if they're not truth aimed like this, maybe even the fact that you believe in evolutionary theory is just because it helps you to survive. So that's why it has to be.
We did a video on this with Sabor, I think last week maybe, or the week before. And we were covering this idea that evolution isn't concerned with truth. That it's practicality. It's what's pragmatic in terms of surviving and reproducing.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And obviously people had mentioned this prior to Plantinga, but the robust argument of this sort, this is Plantinga's argument. So yeah, they're in essence the conditions. So in a case where you have a perceptual belief, or for instance, a memory, if I ask you what you had for breakfast this morning, you might tell me egg and chips, and you don't, again, reason from other propositions. That's just a basic belief and so on. So in all these cases, it seems that we are rational and justified in holding these beliefs, providing that we fulfill these conditions and there's no defeater to our belief. And there are a few other things that I could mention in contrast to other accounts, but I think that's sufficient for the moment. What Plantinga tries to say is that if we look at all of the rival accounts of knowledge, if you don't have this property of proper function of the faculties, you will always trip up somehow. So what Plantinga also, I'm kind of going a little bit around.
Yeah, it's fine, brother.
What Plantinga also wants to shatter is what's called classical foundationalism. So again, it's a bit of a technical word, but foundationalism is a theory of about justification within epistemology. So in other words, in order for a belief to be justified, let's say you believe X on the basis of Y, and so on, and you have to get to a point where you have a foundational belief where you don't believe this on the basis of any other propositions. That's
the axioms and
yeah, exactly. So because otherwise you could have an infinite regress, and you wouldn't have justification. Although there are people who try to develop the infinite regress through coherentism in a circular way, but we'll leave that for the moment. So classical foundationalism, which we see in the work of Descartes and Locke and others, they think that the basic beliefs that we have, those ones that we can believe without referring to any other propositions are essentially three types. So they are perceptual beliefs and incorrigible beliefs. So those beliefs which, you know, you're aware of your own mental states. You're aware that you're feeling tired and so on. Like, they are basic beliefs for you, and they are certain for you. And then also basically like logical or mathematical truths. 1 + 1 is 2, or the principle of non-contradiction, so on. The problem with that thesis is that for Plantinga, it seems to rule out a number of other propositions which we couldn't say are justified anymore. So for instance, we believe in other minds, right? So I'm having this conversation with you. I believe that you have a mind and that you're conscious, you have feelings and so on of the sorts that I have, and that you're not just some kind of robot. But can I prove that? Can I prove that? Well, it seems that, you know, the arguments to prove that are lacking, really. The only argument that you have is an analogical one, where, you know, you compare yourself with another person, and then you infer from that they are conscious, but that's not necessarily the case. So if you take classical foundationalism, it rejects this type of belief as being, it's not a basic belief because it's not of those three kinds. And also you can't seem to justify it in reference to argument. So you're going into this sort of extreme skepticism. So Plantinga said this doesn't make sense. And one of the problems is classical foundationalism, he says, is self-refuting, because classical foundationalism, the principle or the idea itself, it isn't a basic belief. So that proposition that classical foundationalism is true, that isn't a basic belief of the three categories. And also there are no good reasons, ultimately, which go down to a basic belief from which you can say that it is true. So we should reject classical foundationalism. And so he thinks, according to his theory of warrant, that other beliefs, like other minds, and for instance, memory and other things, he thinks that they can be justified following proper functionalism. And so he tries to apply all of this now to the belief in God. So can God be justified in a similar way that we are justified in believing that there are other minds? So I'll just quickly get through this one. So he says that if God exists, he's assuming, of course, in this case, he's not trying to prove that God exists here, but he's just trying to say that God can be a properly basic belief for certain believers in certain circumstances.
Can I ask you, is he kind of like putting out all the possibilities for us having faculties that are truth-seeking and picking the best explanation for that? Or would you say that there's something else going on?
Like, can you elaborate on what you mean exactly?
So you said he's not trying to prove God. So he starts off with this assumption that God exists, which to some degree suggests to me that if he's not trying to prove the existence of God, he's looking at these kind of like intuitive beliefs, say, that we have this capacity within us to seek and find truth. And then he's looking at the varying explanations of this. So you've mentioned the foundationalism, etc. And that there's always room for skepticism in these things, and that they ultimately fail, they undermine themselves. And then I guess once you've kind of gone through all of these, then you can refer back to a common one, which is God, or the belief that there's a creator which bestows upon us these faculties, and that he bestows them upon us with the purpose of seeking truth and being able to do that. And so is this kind of an argument to the best explanation rather than as a proof for God itself?
Okay. No, I understand. No, it's not even that. It's not an argument for the best explanation. So Plantinga, in other places, Plantinga is well known, for instance, for developing a unique version of the ontological argument. And he has this. There's this book called Half a Dozen or So Arguments for the Existence of God or something. It's based on something Plantinga said. So, he thinks that there can be decent arguments. He doesn't necessarily think that these arguments compel someone, rationally speaking, to have to accept the belief in God from his point of view. But in this case, what he's doing is he's talking about what makes a thing sufficient for knowledge. And then he's thinking, okay, how can God, the belief in God or beliefs about God, fit within this account? If we are warranted in believing that there are other minds, well, can we apply this same sort of process to our belief in God? Because there is some kind of similarity in the way that we not the way that we come about these beliefs, but rather that in the case of other minds, we don't have good reasons. And he says in the case of God, even if we don't have good reasons, does that mean again that we're not justified? Not necessarily. Okay. And interestingly, his first book that he wrote is called God and Other Minds. So in like 1967 or something. So he was always he was saying this like as soon as he graduated, I think. So basically, he's not trying to prove that God exists in his thesis of Reformed Epistemology, but he's trying to say that people, believers in God, don't need to prove that God exists in order to be justified in believing that he does. And so when it comes to Reformed Epistemology now and this Jure objection, that the idea that, the people who believe in God just do it because they, construct this figure of God so that they can get through life. Well, he says, look, if God exists, God could have created within human beings a faculty which he calls the sensus divinitatis, which I guess is a Latin phrase, but it is. Not that I know Latin, but that means, a divine sense. And so through this divine sense, and in conjunction with different experiences, maybe when you ponder upon nature, or you look out upon the horizon, or you pray and so on, this faculty could produce these basic immediate beliefs in God that are not based on any other proposition. And if this sensus divinitatis and this thesis can fit along the lines of proper functionalism, then the believer can be warranted in believing God in a basic way. So what that means is that for people who say, you believe in God just because of the fact that, you're suffering and you're going through all of this, what he says is that actually these people, they are already assuming that God doesn't exist in the first place. Because, in fact, if God does exist, in those times when we are suffering and down and we need God, actually, this is because we have a sensus divinitatis and not because, of other means. So you're just assuming that God doesn't exist and God hasn't implanted this in us.
And that itself would be an unjustified assumption without any argumentation or evidence. Can I ask as well, so this, I can't remember the Latin. Go on.
Yeah, so that's it. And then I'll just end it now. So then he says at the end of the day, if a believer is warranted in this basic way, providing there are no philosophical defeaters, then they're warranted. And so it seems that people who want to make this objection are assuming God doesn't exist. But we can have properly basic belief in God, so they should present us with arguments. We are already justified in our belief. It's you who should present us arguments. So in a way, he also flips it on them.
Yeah, it's interesting because you often hear the atheist specifically refer to atheism as the default position. But that is, again, that's assuming the truth of the non-existence of God. And if God does exist, and there is such thing, because what you've mentioned there, the Latin, I'm not going to be able to repeat it, but it's basically equivalent to the Islamic concept of the fitra. And you go into mentioning this in your essay when you start to talk about Ibn Taymiyyah. And it would make sense that if God does exist, and he implemented us with this awareness of him, or an ability to be aware of him, that then you would be justified. And it also, to say that everyone would have to argue and reason their way into these abstract, esoteric debates in order to be able to prove God's existence to them, that would make God an elitist and only available to the highest of IQs. And it's also presupposing that everyone is born with this super ability to reason and to be rational. And I don't know whether or not you agree with this, but for me, I feel as though we're not. Go on, sir.
Yeah, I agree 110%. And this is why I was interested in Reformed epistemology in a way. And that's why I'm also, I feel close to Ibn Taymiyyah's perspective on it, because, philosophically, I think it's problematic. But also theologically speaking, it's maybe even more problematic, because the way of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba, the way that they taught the message of Islam was not for people to go about reasoning and engaging in abstract philosophical proofs before that they could say their shahada and accept Islam. So yeah.
Yeah, well, it's like I say, it kind of presupposes this sort of elitism in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it just seems absurd that people who are not necessarily capable of this higher abstract reasoning, they wouldn't have access to God. And that if he existed, he'd make himself available in a way that, regardless of your intelligence level, that you'd be able to draw yourself close to him. So I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions. So there's something you mentioned in your essay, and if I could just ask you to kind of distinguish between these things. So you make mention of there's a difference between a basic belief and properly basic belief, and obviously those are distinct, but it's not necessarily clear why they're distinct, or what makes something properly basic rather than just basic. Could you give like a brief explanation of that for the listeners?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually quite simple. Even though I might not have spelled it out in the paper, I don't know, but I think I did mention it.
It's not that you've not explained it well. It's just that we're presupposing that the audience hasn't necessarily read the article.
That's a fair point. But obviously, maybe I also didn't explain it well. But it's quite simple. The only difference between a basic belief and a properly basic belief is that the properly basic belief is one which is warranted, one that actually has justification. So you have a basic belief that you see this class, or that I see this class, okay, and if I fulfill the conditions that Plantinga suggests, then that's a properly basic belief. That's a belief which is basic in the sense that it's immediate, not based on any other propositions, but it's also justified.
Okay. And the other thing that I wanted you to expand on, you make reference to this internalism and this externalism. And when I was reading it, first of all, prior to us, because we had a conversation about this before we've done this recording, and intuitively, it made me think of a sort of, when you say externalism and that the thoughts are external, that it was kind of implementing some sort of materialism on thoughts and that they're outside of you or beyond. And I guess I got myself a little bit confused with that. Could you explain the difference between these two things?
Yes, I can. So in essence, externalism, as I said in the paper, is first and foremost just a denial of internalism. So it's, if you understand internalism, then it's easy to understand externalism. But internalism is basically a particular category or branch or way of thinking about epistemic justification. So about what makes a belief justified. If you're an internalist, you think that you need to have some kind of awareness or access to the reasons which confer justification on your belief. So usually this is coupled with evidentialism, like the idea that you need to have like a certain sort of evidence, propositional evidence, I should say, in order for your belief to be justified. So, for instance, people who totally reject reformed epistemology, they might say, this is not the case, because in order for your belief in God to be justified, you need to have propositional evidences, you need to have arguments. And so they would be internalists because they think that you need to have some kind of internal access within yourself. You need to be aware of those reasons, those propositions, which make your belief justified. But an externalist, like Plantinga's proper functionalism, which is based on as long as the faculties are functioning properly and aimed at true beliefs and so on, the believer doesn't have to be aware of good arguments or the reasons or have that internal access, but they can still be warranted.
Okay, and how would the believer then, or even the disbeliever, know whether these faculties were functioning properly? Is there a way for them to actually figure that out, or is this something that's, we're talking hypothetically, if it is the case, then X, Y, Z? Or is there a way of kind of exploring that and trying to...
No, what Plantinga mentions about proper function is that it's related to what he calls a design plan as well. So perhaps I should have mentioned that. So he says that as long as the faculties are functioning properly according to their design plan. So for instance, and when he uses the term design plan, he's not assuming a theistic design. He says that design plan could be as a result of evolution or anything. It's just that's the way that they work. So, I think on average, like your heart or the hearts are supposed to be have a number of beats per minute, right? So if your heart beats way too much per minute, then you have some problem. You need to go to the hospital. You need to go to the doctors, because your faculty here is not functioning according to how it has been designed, how it should be. And again, it's the same with the brain and our faculties. So yeah, there is a way of obviously seeing whether your faculties are working according to how they're supposed to work, according to the design plan.
Okay, and so this kind of brings on this idea of we've been talking about how you justify certain things, how you justify certain beliefs. So now I guess we can kind of move from there into the question of, so we've been talking about the ability to reason and to search and seek and find truth. But then this idea of reason, or the ability to reason,
yeah.
How is it that we justify this? And this gives rise to a particular issue, in the sense that we've now kind of turned reason upon itself, and we need to figure out a way to say that we're justified in our trust in our abilities to reason. And the issue arises here in that if we are trying to offer a justification for reason, we're going to have to give a reasoned argument, which is somewhat circular. And this stems similarly from, because Descartes tried to do something similar, and it was called the Cartesian circle, because he gave a reasoned explanation for the existence of God. He said that God is a trustworthy and all good being, and that he gave us the capacity to reason, and so therefore we can trust our ability to reason. And then people pointed out here that, well, you've made point A, and that's justified with point B, but point B is justified with point A, and then you have this back and forth. Now, have you got any, would you incline towards Descartes in any sense, with this kind of justification for reason, or have you got any dispute with the way he maybe presented his argument?
Yeah, well, I think you spell it out really nicely, to be fair. I mean, for me, if the argument is circular, then that is fallacious, and I don't think that you're justified anymore in basing your belief on that kind of an argument. So I think the problem is, you can't really justify reason in the sense that, you're trying to give good reasons for the fact that you have reason, because obviously you're using reason in order to go and come up with some reasons. Yeah. So the way I see is that reason in essence is a first principle, is an axiom. And again, if I follow proper functionalism, I don't think that I need to have necessary access to the reasons. But yeah, that's what I would say in essence, really. I think, yeah.
So could I say that
And
this
just
is
to
the
add,
thing?
I think if you any other way of going about it, you end up in a self-defeating kind of position. So that's
But it's a weird one because this idea of axiomatic or self-evident, I think Descartes refers to it as a distinct true belief or something clearly and distinct.
yeah,
Now, the thing is it's not exactly obvious what makes something clear and distinct or something axiomatic or something obvious in that sense. And for me, I guess the way I kind of look at Descartes' argument is that sometimes it's often, well, most of the time, it's often misrepresented. So if it kind of stems from this idea of innate ideas, or that we have these things within us. And
yeah,
this also leads a bit back to Socrates when he talks about certain ideas like the idea of perfection, of the infinite, of equality. He says that we can't get any of these ideas from the external world because we never actually experience them. Like the infinite,
yeah,
for example, you might look into the sky and say, "Oh, look, there's the infinite." That's where the idea come from. But you can easily just get a telescope and say, "Well, no, that's not the infinite. Look, you can see a little bit further. You've got a limit to how far you can see."
yeah,
And these ideas are presupposed in other ideas. So, for example, the infinite is presupposed necessarily in the idea of the finite. You can't have things with limits on them if there's not something that doesn't have limits in which these limits are being placed. And so these ideas don't seem to be things that we've experienced externally, but we have them. And he refers to them as remembering, in the sense that you can kind of work backwards through the terms that we have available to us, and you're basically just kind of looking at where you've come from. And for
yeah,
me, it's with Descartes again, when he was reasoning his way to God, I think if you don't look at it in the senses that you're using reason to justify God, but that you're kind of working your way back to the foundation of your being, and you're discovering or remembering these innate ideas that are within you, that from there you've gotten to your foundation, and then you're able to turn around, because it, like he refers to it as throwing everything out of the basket in his meditations.
yeah,
Like he's trying to get back to as a foundational basis of his being as he possibly can, and getting rid of as many false beliefs as he can. And for me, this doesn't seem so much circular as it is a going back to the beginning, to turn around, to go back to as far as you possibly can. And then once you've reached that bottom point where you've got these innate ideas, you've got these things that you don't really have any other explanation for, other than the fact that they must have already have been present, and that there's something about these that can't be explained by reference to the external world, and they can't be explained with combinations of other ideas, so like factitious ones, like the griffin, or the unicorn. These things
yeah,
where you've got two ideas that you've combined to make another one.
yeah,
And if you think of it that way, this is also in line with this idea of the fitra, that you've got these of properly basic beliefs, I guess, which are within you, and that they are foundational to you. And once you've discovered them, that you can then turn around again and begin to build upon things. And for me, this kind of defeats this idea that his argument was circular, because it's not so much that it's circular, but it is this turning back, getting back to the beginning, figuring it out, and then moving forward again. Would you have any contention with that, or do you think that makes sense? Or
Well, I don't necessarily subscribe to innate ideas, and I don't even. I think also relating fitra with innate ideas is not necessarily the right approach either. But there are, it depends. There are actually different interpretations of what the fitra is in Islamic history. But I think, again, if you want to say that there are innate ideas, then surely you can't just claim it and just assume it, right? You
Yeah.
can't just say, okay, we have innate ideas. Okay, that's fine. 'Cause the problem is that in order to justify reason, if you're making reference to innate ideas, then you need to give us reason, I think, for us to accept the thesis of innate ideas. But then again, you're using reason to go about that. So I think it is quite hard to get out of the circle.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's with regards to it, you could say, like how you mentioned the idea that reason is itself this axiomatic baseline, that it just is. Why
Yeah.
can't we make that kind of claim for innate ideas? Like, why would it?
Well, I think there is a bit of a difference uh, between reason and innate ideas in that sense, because the thing with reason is that you can't make any claims without presupposing it. But you could you could in theory explain epistemology without reference to innate ideas. I think so. But in theory, you have to presuppose reason. But I wouldn't say in theory you have to presuppose innatism or something like that.
So, with regards to, say, for example, that this idea of the infinite,
Yeah.
if it isn't an innate idea, how is it that we've come about acquiring it?
Well, I mean, I don't think. What I would like to know is why you think that we need to have innate ideas to think that we've developed the concept of an infinite. I mean, it seems to me like I think I was reading a book a while ago by Wittgenstein called Uncertainty. I think I mentioned this to you before. Well, the book, but not necessarily the idea. And although I do think that there are a priori, like, basic truths, um, like mathematical truths and so on, which are not based on empiricism. So I can know that 1 and 1 is 2 without, without reference to empirical things. But Wittgenstein basically said in one of his notes, like, he was basically saying, let's be honest, how did you learn that 60 add 40 is 100? You went to school, and a teacher taught you, how to do multiplication, how to add up, basically. So for me, if we think about it realistically, it seems that we learn about these concepts through reference to these concepts that we developed over time, really. I mean, if you have, we quickly learn about the idea of limits. So why not, then be able to extrapolate the idea of there being no limits as a concept? And then we obviously, it also has a place within mathematics as well.
Okay, so I guess my issue with that is that when we're thinking of ideas, when you experience something, the idea that this experience is representing never has more reality in it than the thing that it's an idea of. So if you experience a horse, you'll have this impression of it on your mind, and the idea, it's not possible for that idea to have more detail in it than is in the thing that it's an experience of. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right. So it's always like a watered down version of it, and it's in the same way. If you put a red sock in a load of washing that's white, the white washing isn't going to come out more red than the red sock.
Yeah.
And it's this idea of the transferring of information from the object of experience to the impression in the mind. It can't be of a greater quantity than the thing that gave rise to it. Now, transferring this to the idea of the infinite. So you've made this claim that we've experienced finite things, and then we can extrapolate from this the infinite. But is this not to talk in a sense to say that we've gotten this idea that has more reality out of something that has not that much reality compared to it? So in the sense that when you say that we can come up with the idea of the infinite from the idea of the finite, even though the word finite, to put limits, presupposes the infinite, is that not kind of saying I've put a red sock in with the white washing and the washing's come out more red?
I don't see why it is. I don't follow the analogy in this way, really. No.
Because the infinite is like, so for example, if I'm drawing a square,
Yeah.
in order to draw that square, there has to be space that extends beyond that square. And once I've drawn the square, we can say we've got this limited thing here now. And but because that exists, the limited thing, the square itself, is dependent upon the space that it's drawn within. Mm-hmm. And we can say the same thing with finite things. Mm-hmm. The existence of finite things are dependent upon the infinite around them, or the things without limits. Mm-hmm. And you can move or you can put the finite things there, you can take them away. It never takes anything away from that which you're placing them in. And mm-hmm. it's the same with this idea of the infinite. Like, when you are placing finite things in the world, they're constantly presupposing this idea of the infinite. They're constantly dependent upon the infinite for their existence. And so this is what I mean when I made reference to Socrates, that there's this idea of remembering something, and it's not that you've experienced it empirically, and it's not that the finite gave cause to the infinite thing, because it can't give cause to the infinite thing, because the infinite is presupposed in order for that finite thing to exist in the first place. So if you're saying that the idea of the finite then gives rise to the infinite, you've inverted the dependency. You're saying that this idea is reliant upon the finite thing, even though the existence of the finite thing is reliant upon the infinite.
Yeah.
And so it's like it's a sense of discovery. So like you can you find clues and you work your way backwards. This presupposes this presupposes this, and then from that you can discover the source of it.
Yes.
But then again, this is why I would say that this becomes analogy to understanding that the idea of the finite would be the pink socks, and then you can presuppose from that there must have been a red sock there that caused this whitewashing to change. Yeah. And I guess that's where the analogy lies.
Yeah, I get it more this time. But I think the thing is, the problem, one of the problems I see with the idea of maybe innate ideas is its claim that people are born with these specific innate ideas. So people are born with innate ideas. People enter into the world with ideas. But, I think if we look at different cultures, different places, people are not necessarily, it doesn't seem to me that people are born with these ideas, the same ideas, particularly about metaphysics. And also, what is it to say that a young baby has an innate idea? For me, I think to bring Kant into the picture, which is obviously related to your paper, for me, he kind of, maybe his account is probably the way to go here, although not in the fully Kantian sense. But obviously, if you contrast the idea of a tabula rasa, of a blank slate, and then an innatism, then he has this kind of this way of saying that the mind has certain categories. It's set up to understand things in a certain way, and when it experiences the world, that's filtered through these kind of these categories. I think this is closer also to the fitra in a way, because like Ibn Taymiyyah also, he mentions that that it's not that people are born. If, for example, the Prophet Muhammad said that every child is born on the fitrah, right? And it's only the parent of the Christian, the Jew, or the Zoroastrian that alters that disposition. So the Prophet ﷺ is not saying that this child is born with this innate idea of Islam, believing in the books and the angels and the messengers and the full content of Islam, but that this child is born with this this inclination, this disposition to understand and experience the world in a certain way.
Can I ask then? There's also the account of the souls um,
Yeah.
giving testimony to Allah Subhanahu wa Taala
Yeah.
prior to being placed in the body. So could we not say that this itself, this experience of God prior to becoming bodied in the cradle for souls before we're placed here in this world, would that itself, could you not argue that it gave rise to these ideas, and that would therefore make them innate? Because once you've moved from there to the material realm, you've been placed in a body. When you said you're not sure that kids have this idea of the infinite, to be honest, I think that they do, because there's always this concept of more. They can move from this limited temporal idea to then just imagining it never ending, or can this go on forever? And they don't necessarily have to have anyone tell them this. They can just they can just refer to it themselves, and in order to be able to do that, that idea already has to be present. It can't just arise out of nothing.
Yeah, well, I think, like, for me, that we're born with a certain set of faculties, and they are, according to a design plan, and they're supposed to function in a certain way, and they've been set up in a certain way, so that we can filter, so that they filter our experience, and through experience we learn more, and we're able to develop ideas and concepts. I don't think that we have to necessarily posit innatism. Again, the child has a mind which is has a sort of built-in categories, maybe, if you want to use that term, which help it filter its experience. But I think back to the fitra example that you mentioned, which I think is a very important and good point, and I think it is a fine line between innatism and a Taymian position, if you will, which I think is not exactly the same as innatism on this issue. But there are elements within his work which he seems to imply innatism about God, and then other times he seems to suggest that it's just this inclination. This quwwa is a term he uses, which I think is, he sets it out more systematically in those terms. But yes, the people, all of us, stood before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we testified that he is our Lord. But obviously we forgot that.
But this is where I come back in to referring to remembering. So you used a very particular word there. You said we forgot. But would that experience itself still not leave an impression, which could then be remembered? And would that not also motivate this, what you've referred to as an inclination?
Yeah, for me, I mean, it's not, the thing is, like I'm saying, it's not, in theory, to me, it doesn't seem necessary that we have to explain this in reference to innatism. You can. I don't see the reason as being definitive. Maybe you do, but I'm not so convinced. But I think that you can also explain this by saying that, obviously we forgot this moment, but when we are put into the world, the remnants of that remain, in a sense, in that we have this inclination capacity, which is not exactly the same as innate ideas, but there's a fine line. Yeah.
Okay. Sometimes it feels like when we're talking about innate ideas, because you made reference to the categories of Kant, and one thing that would really stump me in the Kant lessons, so he refers to time and space as categories as well, and he says that these things are not, you won't find them in the things. These things, you will not find them in the things themselves. So the objects of your experience, there's this, there's the experience of them, and then there's the thing in themselves which gives rise to the experience. And he says this thing that's giving rise to your experiences, they're not subject to time and space. That time and space are the categories of the mind, and you experience things, and then it imposes temporal and spatial qualities on the things in themselves, which then gives rise to the experience of them. This was weird to me, because time and space themselves, he's shifted them from this into this weird realm where they seem to be both an idea and a mechanism simultaneously. And then I'm guessing if you're looking at them as an idea, then you would refer to them as, say, innate. But if you're not, if you're looking at them as a mechanism, calling them an idea begins to sound strange. And so then if it does sound strange, referring to them as ideas, if they're just like parts of a structure that help things along, maybe then innate wouldn't follow from that. Then is the issue then not just semantics there, in terms of like I'm not really looking at these innate ideas as necessarily just structural mechanical things that help a process, and you're looking at them in the sense that you are looking at them in that way, and not as concepts, not as ideas. And then how is it that how should we understand that, the way that he's expressed them in a way that kind of joins the two, this idea of a mechanical structure with this concept of an idea simultaneously?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I'm not a Kantian, like epistemically speaking. Well, I'm not a Kantian in any way, really, and I don't really like many things that he said, to be frank. But I think it's not semantics. I think there is a bit of a distinction. It's it's not often that clear. Like the way that you put it, it does show that there is this sort of nuance which maybe could fall into semantics. It depends. You have to be clear on it. But for me, as I'm saying that, when the human being enters into the world, they enter into the world with a certain set of cognitive faculties, and they've been created according to a certain disposition, which is the fitrah. And in virtue of having this fitrah, this is you might say like a guiding lamp for reason and for the other faculties, and this light or this lamp helps us to synthesize things, to understand things. In fact, Ibn Taymiyyah, he said that if it wasn't for this capacity within the heart, which he's referring to the fitrah, not language wouldn't be possible, discourse, knowledge, or anything. So we have to have this kind of I don't know if it's a filtering mechanism. I don't know if that's the way of thinking about it, but that's the way I roughly understand it. And then if this becomes corrupted due to society, then people will not be able to come to the right metaphysical beliefs, at least.
Okay, so kind of drawing this back to the initial topic of the limits of reason.
Yeah.
So in what sense are we saying then that belief in God, or that God, the existence of God or the non-existence of God, is reason playing a part in proving this? Because it feels like we are, and then that there's still this circular element, and that we've not really escaped it, because we're still using reason to kind of explain this idea of the fitrah, and that we've got these internal beliefs and things like that, and then it feels so still Cartesian circle-y, if that makes sense. Like
it only would be Cartesian circularness if what I'm trying to do, or someone, I mean the people before me, I'm a nobody, but I'm just following the ideas. But if what they were doing is they're trying to prove the existence of God in reference to the fitrah, exactly, I don't think that that's the way it is. The way that maybe that might have been the approach of some, but the way I think that we should understand it is in reference to this idea that people can be justified without having arguments. But with reason itself, you're never going to be able to escape the fact that it's a first principle, because, like I said, whenever you go about doubting it, whenever you go about trying to justify, you're always assuming it every time you go. But I think it's important to come back to, as you said, the topic about limits of reason, because I have a few things to say on that, I guess.
Yeah, go.
but I also want to make it very clear, as much as that I've put forward this paper which tries to suggest that believers in Islam specifically, so we didn't get to mention this, but obviously after I give the planting in account in brief, then I go on to critique, an account that was offered by a couple of Christian philosophers. They tried to develop an Islamic version, if you like, which I deem to have been incompatible with planting and epistemology. And I developed a new account which is based on Ibn Taymiyyah's Fitra and related to ayat in the universe and in the Quran. But as much as I'm saying that Islam can be justified for the believer without having arguments, that doesn't mean that I don't think that there are good arguments. And that I'm not saying that reason cannot produce good arguments. Rather, I think that we can.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point to make as well, because atheists might be watching this and they might be taking this as a move towards trying to say that there aren't any arguments, and it's kind of like a futility, an argument to futility, that that we've not been able to sufficiently argue for the existence of God, and so now we're just trying to say, oh, we don't need an argument. That isn't, like you say, that's not what this paper is trying to do at all. It's just trying to, from what I took, that it's kind of being sympathetic to the fact that not everyone is capable of higher reasoning or for philosophical discourse in these kind of esoteric venues or ways to get to God, and that this itself, just because they can't do it, it doesn't mean that they're not justified in the belief in God. Because obviously, if we can prove to ourselves rationally or evidentially that God does exist, we may be justified more so in certain ways, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're less justified or that they're not justified at all.
Yes.
Which is definitely an important point to make. We've been talking for about an hour now.
Inshallah, it's going
so,
quick.
Yeah, alhamdulillah, it was a very nice conversation. Would you like to leave it here? Maybe, inshallah, we can have a little listen over it, think about any kind of direction we would have liked to have taken it, or any points we might have missed, and maybe have another conversation in the future. Or is there anything else that you want to kind of expand on?
Yeah, we can do. I think, well, I would like to just say a couple of things quickly, and then maybe we can discuss this another time, because I think we have spent a lot of time talking about my paper and stuff like that, and maybe not that much in reference to your own, and also some of the some of the consequences of that. So I think, for instance, when we spoke before the other day, we talked about the idea. Well, you mentioned it already anyway in the video, and now about Kant's thesis that there's a distinction between things in themselves and things as they appear to us, and that but we didn't go on to talk about how Kant might relate this to the existence of God, or to speaking about God and so on. So, for instance, Kantians who have taken up his epistemology, I think one of them, for instance, Gordon Kaufman, he suggests, on the basis of Kant's epistemology, that at the end of the day, all that we have is the concepts and categories that are related to our experience, and God is ultimately beyond this phenomenal world, and he's beyond our concepts and categories, and so we can't talk about him meaningfully. In fact, we can't even think about God really, because to think about God is to think about a being who is beyond all of our categories of reference. But the problem, I think, as we mentioned, is that this seems to have an element of being self-defeating as well, because to make statements like you can't think about God, you can't speak about God, you are thinking about it. You're presupposing a very concept which you're saying we can't talk about.
Yeah, definitely. Kant did a similar thing with the thing in itself. So he said, we can't know anything about the thing in itself. And you can talk about similar things with the unknown. So the unknown is literally defined as that which we don't know, but we do know that we don't know anything about the unknown. So that there's still things you can extrapolate from. And although you might not be able to determine particular actualities about what isn't known, you can develop knowledge on the possibilities. So when you're venturing into a world you've never gone to, so like for example, you went to Turkey,
Yeah.
you've never had an experience before. Turkey, for all intensive purposes, prior to experience it, was the unknown. But
Yeah.
there is certain knowledge that you have moving into the unknown. You know that there's possible danger, that you need to be alert, aware, careful, that that there's certain things that you're going to need to adapt to. Like people might have different customs, and you might need to present yourself in certain ways and avoid certain things that might be considered rude there. And so although Turkey, for all intents and purposes, was the unknown, there are still things that you can know about it. Same problem with chaos as well. And so with regards to this idea of God, saying that we can't know anything about him, there's an issue with this for the same reasons you've mentioned. But it also depends on, first of all, if God does exist and he was to give revelation, and in this revelation there was to be knowledge, then it would follow from that if all of these steps are true, that we would then be able to have knowledge of God, and that it would be justified if he is in fact true. And so this is where we would come into mentioning revelation, like the Quran, and how that if we do have knowledge of this, and the fitra is real, and that we do have these inclinations to believe in God, and that these are reasonable inclinations, then this all would certainly count as knowledge, so long as all of these ifs and buts fall in place. And
Yeah, that's true. But at the end of the day, for me, like I've been trying to emphasize in the case of reason, look, if we haven't got good reasons to accept a particular theory, and the justification for that is self-defeating, we have to throw it away, and we have to go with what's commonsensical, and what we seem to all agree on is basically rational and justified. So the same seems with the Kantian picture of not being able to speak about God, or to even know that he exists in a way. It seems to be sort of implying that, and certainly theologians like Kaufman have gone down that route. So we have to do away with that. And so it seems to me that we can be justified in our basic common sense, really. Because if we start to reject it, we end up going into these problematic holes most of the time, or a lot of the time they're self-defeating and so on, or sometimes circular. And so yeah, and I think at the end of the day, there's a distinction between knowing that God is and knowing what God is. So for instance, like reading the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says like, Laysa kamithlihi shay, so there is nothing like him. وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ, so he is the hearing, and he is the hearing, the seeing. So Allah is saying, look, he's beyond anything. He's beyond our concepts of reference, in a sense, in the sense that Allah is not like anything that we experience. But at the same time, he's saying, وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ, that he is the hearing and the seeing. So yes, we might not be able to know the essence of Allah in and of himself, but it doesn't mean that we can't know that he hears and that he sees. We know that, but we don't know, what Allah is in essence necessarily.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. It's probably a brilliant place to end the talk as well. So we'll leave it there. Jazakallah khair for your time today. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and we'll try and arrange something for the future, inshallah. We'll see how everyone responds. But yeah, if you've enjoyed it, please remember to leave a like, comment below with any questions you might have for either myself or for Brother Jamie. And I'll pass them on, or I'm sure he'll keep an eye on the comment section, and inshallah maybe even respond to them. Yeah, and other than that, remember to share, subscribe. Do you have any social media accounts you'd like to reference? Like I've mentioned, or you mentioned before, the video of your reversion story, I'll put that in the description box below.
Yeah, you can do, even though it's not my channel, but yeah, I don't have a channel.
No, it's fine. It's it's a bit of reference for you. But I'll also leave a link to your article in the description box below. Do you want me to reference anything like a social media account, or?
Yeah, you can do. I mean, I'll send you my profile, like Facebook profile. Or
Inshallah. I'll put that in there as well. But other than that, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.